As a professional portrait photographer, it's crucial that I get sharp photos for my clients. If I take photos that end up being blurry or out of focus, I could risk getting negative reviews and a loss of a potential repeat client. In order to avoid this, I follow certain steps to ensure that my photos are as sharp as possible. So in this guide, I'll be sharing the same 7 steps and tips I follow in order to get sharp photos straight out of the camera. So let's dive right in. The first tip I have to ensure sharp photos is to have proper lighting. Hands down, I believe having proper lighting in your scene or on your subject is the most important factor when it comes to getting sharp photos. If you take a look at what sharpness actually means, you'll find that it's the clarity of detail our eyes are able to notice and how well defined the edges of subjects are within our image. In other words, it's the micro contrasts between the edges and transitions between different textures or colors within the image. Examples of these micro contrasts can be seen with the detail in your subject's eyes, the pores on a subject's skin, or the feathers on a bird if you take wildlife photography. So if sharpness relies on these micro contrasts, then we need general high-level contrast to be on our image in the first place. And contrast is created from the interplay of light and shadow, which creates depth and dimension. So we need light in order to create contrast in the first place, but not just any light. The quality, direction, and intensity of our light influences the contrast in our image, which then affects the micro contrast in our image, which affects the overall sharpness of our image. Speaking as a portrait photographer, I've been able to capture sharp images using purely natural light. But I found that when I use artificial light such as a strobe or speed light or other light source in my environment, that's when I'm really able to capture my sharpest images. And this is because I was able to create that quality of contrast with artificial light that allowed me to have all of these micro contrasts in my image. Being familiar with the different qualities of light such as hard light and soft light, the different directions of light like side lighting, Rembrandt lighting, backlighting, etc., and the intensity of light and balancing your exposure with it is the most fundamental aspect of ensuring you get a sharp photo. So all in all, if you want sharpness, then you need micro contrasts in your image. In order to have micro contrasts, you need general contrast in your image. And to create general contrast, then you need to have an interplay of light and shadow in your image, which can only be created from having a light source. But you can't just have a light source and call it a day. You need to be aware of the quality, direction, and intensity of your light source, as that will affect the quality of contrast. Now, if you're wondering, okay, well, what type of lighting is best for sharp photos? Well, there really is no best lighting, but my favorite as a portrait and headshot photographer that have always led me to have sharp photos is to use my speed light with an umbrella or my studio strobe with a softbox for soft light. The second tip I have to ensure sharp photos is to have proper focusing technique. You'll want to ensure you are focusing in camera on your most important part of the scene, the area you want to draw emphasis to. If you're a photographer that photographs live subjects, then this is probably the eyes, and if you're a photographer that photographs inanimate objects, then this will be the point you're trying to emphasize, such as mountains and landscape. Using a particular autofocus point or technique will allow you to maximize your chances for a sharp image. So as a portrait photographer, I often use single point autofocus, place the focus point on my subject's eyes, and then compose my shot. I'm not a landscape photographer, but I've seen the hyperfocal distance focusing technique will allow you to maximize the depth of field and sharpness in your landscapes. So based on what type of photography you shoot, there are focusing techniques that will benefit you more. If you focus on a particular point, then I recommend single point autofocus, which will help you achieve sharp photos. And if you do landscape photography, then hyperfocal distance focusing or focus stacking will help you achieve sharp photos. The third tip is to use a fast shutter speed. Shutter speed is one of the key elements in the exposure triangle that controls the exposure in our images. Shutter speed controls how long your shutter is open and can be used to control the motion effects in your image, such as intentional motion blur or a freeze frame effect. If you use a shutter speed that is too slow and you're shooting handheld, then you can introduce motion blur or camera shake into your image, which will throw any hopes of a sharp image down the drain. This is especially important to remember being a portrait photographer, as I'm often shooting handheld and moving around a lot. If you shoot handheld like me, they say a good rule of thumb is to use a shutter speed that is at least 1 over the focal length of your lens. For example, if you're using a 200mm lens, then you'll want to use at least 1 over 200 of a second for your shutter speed. Personally, I like to photograph a bit faster and usually shoot 1 over 2 times the focal length. So if I'm using a 50mm lens, I want to photograph and have my shutter speed at least 1 over 100th of a second. Now, this leads me into my next tip, image stabilization. Stabilizing your camera and lens before taking a photo is an essential step if you want to achieve sharp photos. There are 3 ways that you can use stabilization. The first is image stabilization. Image stabilization, or IS for short, is a feature that is usually built into certain cameras or lenses. You want to make sure this is enabled, especially in low light scenarios or if you're using a long lens. The second way is to use proper camera holding posture. If you photograph handheld like me, then it's important that you develop a proper camera holding posture, one that gives you a solid base while also being comfortable. A tried and true holding posture is to hold the camera firmly in both hands, brace your elbows against your body to minimize any shake, and then use your camera's viewfinder instead of the LCD to add another point of stability. Another tip I like to use is to press my shutter button by pressing slowly and controlled down on it, instead of a fast slamming down motion, so as to not introduce any jitter or shake when I'm taking the photo. The third way is to use a good old tripod or prop your camera up on a surface. Tripods stabilize your camera, and you'll have the safest form of image stabilization when you use a tripod. Certain styles of photography, such as landscape photography, night photography, or long exposure photography, often requires photographers to use a tripod, as they have but no choice when they use slower shutter speeds. If you don't have a tripod and are in a situation where you can't raise your shutter speed to a fast enough setting for handheld photography, then you can also find a place to prop up your camera. This can mean placing your camera on a ledge, a rail, or even sitting down and placing your camera on your knees. Just be sure you're using some form of camera strap so you don't accidentally drop or break your camera. The fifth tip for sharp photos is to know your lens's sweet spot. Many lenses have a sweet spot in terms of aperture and the f-stop range in which the lens will produce the sharpest images. For example, for my Canon EF 50mm f1.8 lens, the sweet spot is around f2.8 to f5.6, so since I like to shoot with a wide aperture, I usually use f2.8 for my portraits and headshots. For the Canon EF 24-70mm f4L lens, which is more of a zoom lens, the sweet spot is around f5.6 to f8. So I'd recommend searching online to find out what the sweet spot is for your lens, and then shooting within that range if possible for the sharpest images. One thing to also remember, there are quality levels in lenses, with some being more expensive, which can impact the sharpness and distortion of the lens. There are also different types of lenses better suited for your particular style of photography. There are lenses better suited for portrait photography, landscape photography, macro photography, etc. And before you go out and drop thousands on a lens because you can't get sharp photos with your current lens, be sure not to blame your lens and first take into account all these tips I'm giving in this guide. I usually shoot with my Canon EF 50mm f1.8 lens, which only cost me about $125 and has produced some of the sharpest images in my portfolio. So if you can't get sharp photos, first ensure you're following all these tips. The sixth tip for sharp photos is to watch your ISO settings. Similar to aperture and shutter speed, ISO is one of the three elements of your exposure triangle. ISO controls how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. Increasing your ISO makes it more sensitive, and decreasing it makes it less sensitive. As mentioned in my exposure guide, higher ISO settings can introduce digital noise in your image, which can reduce perceived sharpness. Each camera has an ISO level in which if you surpass it, lots of noise will start to show. It's important to know your ISO levels because if you're approaching this level, you may want to make sure you made all the exposure adjustments in your aperture and shutter speed settings so you don't introduce any unwanted noise. While there are noise reduction features in many post-processing software, these tools can make the image appear a little blurry, reducing any perceived sharpness. Here's an image with high noise. And here's an image with less noise, as you can see. The seventh and final tip for sharp photos is to check your equipment. You'll want to ensure your camera sensor and lens are free from any dust or smudges that can affect your image quality. Every once in a while, especially if I do a shoot at a beach or where there is dirt, I check my camera lens to ensure no dirt has smudged over it. There are sensor and lens cleaning kits that have cloths and mini air blowers to blow any dirt out. I got a kit from Amazon and it has made cleaning so much easier. I wear glasses as well, so sometimes I use the cloth that I clean my glasses with to clean my lens as well. And in conclusion, those are my 7 steps and tips if you want to get sharp photos. I hope you learned a new tip that will help you capture sharp photos every time. Thanks for watching.